All right, so here we go. This is my second vlog, or my second vlog on David's vlog, or something. But we have voted and decided that I get to do this one because most of the time I'm about to cover David was in a medically induced coma. We wanted to go back and cover like the actual story as it unfolded, especially for those of you that weren't a direct part or who are totally confused to how we got to today. The whole shebang, as it were, began in February this year, 2016. Middle of the month, right after we saw Deadpool on Valentine's Day, David got sick and had flu-like symptoms for a couple of weeks. And they just kept getting worse and worse. And he was, doing all the stuff to take care of himself. And it kept getting worse and worse. So the 23rd of February, we went into an urgent care. And they did a chest x-ray and that kind of stuff. And turned out that not only did David have the flu, but he also had cardiomyopathy, meaning that his heart was bigger than it should be. It was inflamed, swollen, which was bad juju. So they sent us over to Memorial Hospital here in Colorado Springs, which is where I'm at today. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a tour of where we began the journey and lived for the first couple months. And as we go, I'll kind of fill you in on what happened during that first month. Welcome to the 6th floor of the parking garage at Memorial Hospital. You are looking at the main building there of the hospital where the emergency room is. That is where we started the fun this year. We kind of scroll over here. This is where David ended up most of the time he was here at the hospital. The medical ICU was there, as is the rehab unit and the renal floor, which we'll cover that later. But this is the place where it all began. So we are now inside Memorial Hospital. I'm going to just kind of give a little more information here. Pardon the lack of glasses, my transitions haven't transitioned yet. Anyway, so I think I said before, we came in on the 23rd via ambulance from the emergencies, urgent care, because of the cardiomyopathy, the swelling in his heart. And we came in and they ran a bunch of tests. Pretty much did a direct admit straight up to the 6th floor here, which is just a medical unit. And they came up with the flu, basically, with the cardiomyopathy. Like, we didn't get anything new there. But his symptoms were more severe than they strictly should have been. So they wanted to go ahead and keep him overnight, but David wasn't terribly thrilled with that idea, and neither was I at that point. 34-year-old guy with flu-like symptoms is not necessarily something to get super worked up over. So we talked them into letting us go home. I'm an EMT. I was pretty sure I could keep him alive, so we went ahead and went home that night, did our usual thing, got in bed, fell asleep, and he woke me up about 1 o'clock that morning with severe chest pain, shortness of breath. He was very scared. Of course, we've got a gauge at home, we don't have family here in Colorado, so we ended up having to call the ambulance, and they came and got him and took him to the hospital, where he was admitted. So that was February 24th of this year. And he was admitted for the flu, complications thereof. The chest pain, while scary at home, turned out to really not be much of anything, just a secondary effect of what was going on. So we settled into the hospital at that point, thinking it'd probably be a few days. Of course, we were dreadfully, dreadfully mistaken, but we'll get into that later. Several days in the hospital. On March 3rd, the doctors pulled David and I into his room. Obviously, he was in bed, and told us that they felt like they probably needed to go ahead and put him in a medically induced coma because his symptoms were worsening, his lungs were filling with fluid, and they wanted to keep him prone, which is where you're lying on your face, for several days, because that takes some of the strain off of your lungs, makes it easier for them to get full expansion as you're breathing in and out. And of course that was kind of scary, but they told us it would be 3 to 4 days max, and David would fall asleep and wake up and I'd be right there, and for him no time would have passed at all. So that's what we agreed to do. Again, that was on March 3rd. Unfortunately, my husband has a hell of a drug tolerance, and it took so much medication to take him down. I don't think they truly got him into a coma for almost a full day. Between the Diprovan, the Versed, and the fentanyl they were giving him, the nurses and I were cracking jokes about, elephant tranquilizers, and we were a little concerned we'd never get him awake again, but they finally got him into the prone position, so he's laying on his face, which, if you've never been in the hospital with someone who was prone in a coma, which I'm hoping not many of you have, it's kind of awful to watch. When you're laying on your face like that for so long and never moving, everything swells. So his eyes, like the whites of his eyes, were yellow and jaundiced looking. His eyelids actually got swollen, so they were super thick and puffy. His nose, his lips, everything was just, and his face was purple. It was kind of scary to watch. And then this really strange thing started happening to his hands. His hands, from the tip of the finger down to like the second knuckle, were turning black, particularly on the right hand, not as much on the left, and no one seemed to know what was happening, which was mildly terrifying. His hands just kept getting colder and colder. He looked awful. I intentionally chose not to take any pictures of him during that time period, just because I didn't think that mentally any of our friends or family, particularly being far away and not able to be here themselves, needed to see those pictures, because it was terrifying. And I didn't want David to see them later, because I know that if I looked as not good as he looked and saw pictures of myself, I might freak out and be pretty sure that I was a lot closer to death than anyone had told me. Fortunately, I've got a medical background, and I think that's what pulled me through that part. Now, again, I've mentioned that this coma was supposed to be 3 to 4 days long. Well, by March 8th, his lungs were filling up with blood, just continuing to get worse. Every day they do a chest x-ray in the morning, and every day his lungs were full of more fluid. So they decided to do their first bronchoscopy, which is a procedure where they go down your esophagus and literally just suction goo out of your lungs. It continued to get worse. By the 11th, his fever was spiking out of control in spite of the fact that they were giving him multiple intravenous antibiotics. They still didn't know what the main cause was. They were suspecting bird flu at that point as opposed to just influenza B. But again, he wasn't responding to anything. There was some talk at that point of going ahead and putting in a chest tube just to continually drain out the fluid that was building in his lungs, which ended up not happening at that point. And everyone was just panicking. They eventually added an infectious disease doctor, specializing in hematology or blood diseases. His kidneys started to fail, and no one knew why. But his labs were coming back very abnormal, and it was really scary. Fortunately, one of the things that happened is he ended up with some blood clots in his legs. It's called DVT, deep vein thrombosis, which can happen for a number of reasons. If you have a major illness, if you've got cardiomyopathy, if you've got other issues going on. So they actually put him on some heparin, which is a blood thinner, to help break those up. And it turns out that that's what was causing the microclots in his fingertips, where they were turning black. He actually had blood clots forming and just sitting there in his fingertips, which is why he wasn't getting proper circulation. It eventually got to the point that the blood clots actually burst and broke his skin, and he bled out from under his fingernails. And we discovered that heparin induces thrombocytopenia, so no more heparin for David. Addition of the kidneys going south, they also added a nephrologist or a kidney doctor to his team at that point. Although we still didn't know what was causing the kidneys to go south. They just were. Like, his kidney function wasn't doing as well as it should have been. His creatinine was climbing, which is a lab value that they look at for that. Anyways, they just kept adding people to his team. He had a pulmonologist, a cardiologist, the nephrologist, the blood infectious disease guy, of course, the internist with the hospital. It was getting pretty intense. Obviously, we were living in the ICU at that point. And by March 18th, still in a coma from the 3rd, things are difficult. But they wanted to go ahead and order a brain MRI at that point, because he'd been in a coma for so long. And under the influence of so many major mind-altering medications in order to keep him there, that they were starting to worry about brain damage. So we had to go ahead and do a brain MRI that day, which fortunately, by the way, came back normal. His brain was holding up just fine, but that was scary. We have a severely autistic son at home already, and here we were 1,000 miles from friends and family looking at, my husband, my boyfriend at the time, being brain damaged, gauging his challenges. So that night was St. Patrick's Day. I'm Irish, so I take a lot of pride in St. Patty's Day, but that night I went home and I was stone cold sober, but I sure did run around the house vomiting everywhere, like any receptacle that could be vomited in. I vomited in that night just from pure emotional holy shit, which is probably not a good thing to say on a vlog where people watch, and family and children, and I apologize for my language. But that's the first night that we were really afraid we were going to lose him. Fortunately, like I said, the brain MRI came back normal, and they started to go ahead and see a little bit of improvement in the lungs. They didn't end up having to put in a chest tube at that point, and he started to breathe more successfully on his own. Obviously he was still intubated, and they'd had to put a trach in. A tracheotomy is where they actually put a hole right here that goes directly into your esophagus, so that they could attach that there and breathe for him. But he actually started to do some of it on his own again. So the machines weren't doing all the work. David was actually doing some of the work as well. And it was at that point that they started talking about bringing him up out of the coma. That was March 21st. So that first coma was the 3rd of March to the 21st of March, with him completely unconscious and him prone for the first half of that. And it was definitely one of the most terrifying times of my entire life. David and I have known each other since we were 10 years old. It's 25 years of friendship, not counting where we're at now relationship-wise, but it was pretty terrifying. Anyways, March 21st was the grand finale, if you will, and they decided to bring him up out of the coma, which took probably 4 or 5 days, just because of the amount of medication that he'd been on, and for how long he had been on that medication. So it took a while to get him back, and he was pretty out of it at first. There were also some issues with our first round of ICU delirium, and we will get into that more later. But ICU delirium is something that happens when your body is forced into an unconscious state for an extended period of time. When you're in a coma, you don't actually get REM sleep properly. So basically, he went a little over 3 weeks without any actual deep sleep. So when he was coming out of that coma, he was a little bit nuts. And we'll talk about that some more. The delirium thing, let me just put it out there to begin with, that it was a reoccurring theme for us. Unfortunately, after that first major, long induced coma, every time David had to go back into an induced coma or be sedated for any length of time or given too many sedative medications, he would, as I started calling it, put on his crazy pants. This was our first round, of course, and they got progressively worse each time. The first round started almost cute. There was a bunny in David's room as he was trying to wake up, and it was really freaking him out because you don't generally see a rabbit hopping around an ICU room. That was almost kind of amusing. But then the Brussels attacks happened, the terrorist attacks that happened in Brussels, March 22nd. And some genius had left that up on his TV screen while he was waking up from his coma. So that caused him to have this whole internal story built up where terrorists were coming after Denver International Airport, and he was really frustrated because I wasn't listening when he tried to explain what was happening, mostly because he was still intubated at the time, which made it really difficult for us to communicate. And he didn't have enough strength or dexterity to write anything out at this point. He was still too stoned, so I mean, he would attempt to write and it would just come out a scribble. It was very, very frustrating because he couldn't communicate with me, I could barely communicate with him, and he was terrified that, you know, terrorists were going to get DIA, and I wasn't doing anything about it, so it was stressful for both of us. When he did begin to be able to communicate some after this, he was also furious with Ryan, who is David's best friend. Shout out to Ryan's because apparently there was information in Ryan's kitchen back in Boise, Idaho, that could thwart the terrorist attack that was coming. Again, it almost sounds kind of amusing in retrospect, but it was pretty scary while it was actually happening. And particularly so for David, because he felt like he held vital information that could save people's lives and had no way to communicate it. So that was pretty rough. However, he did start to do better over a few days. There was a few scary moments. A pile of blankets ended up looking like a pile of dead bodies to him at one point. He was pretty sure that we'd actually just put him on a boat off the coast of South America where they were doing tests on him, you know, medical scientific tests that he didn't understand. It messed with his ability to trust the staff considerably, and put a lot more stress in an already stressful situation. So it was kind of an unfortunate side effect of everything. After that, though, he stayed awake with us through the end of March, and here sometime in the near future we'll do another vlog where we will talk about medically induced coma number 2 and the ICU delirium that followed that round. I think that pretty much covers it for now. If you have any questions, be sure to put them down below. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends if you're interested, or you think this would be something that would be helpful for someone else going through, you know, similar strife. And yeah, I mean, definitely let us know. David and I are both really cool about answering questions. And I know that our story is a little disjointed even now as we're trying to piece it back together, just because it's been so long and so insane and so stressful. To anybody else going through anything like this, hang in there. It does get better. It takes its sweet bloody time, but it does get better. So it's worth the fight. Thanks, guys.